There are three aspects.
Water is a really dense medium, and so cetaceans moving through the water encounter a lot of resistance to moving forward. That's called drag. So a lot of the adaptations that we see are to minimize drag. The ideal situation is to have laminar flow of water past the animal's body. That's where the water flows past and just stays sort of parallel to the body surface. The opposite of that is turbulent flow, and that's the kind of situation that you get if there are a lot of disruptions in the outline of the animal's body, like if it's really furry or if it's got a lot of things sticking out of it. So if we look at this baby dolphin, if it was all furry, then the water going past wouldn't go smoothly. It would get all messed up and be all turbulent, which creates a lot more drag. So the ideal situation is this laminar flow where the animal can move very smoothly through the water. And the kinds of things that we see in cetaceans that make this more likely is, first of all, the parabolic body form, so this sort of rounded outline that widens and then gets narrower along the body, so it's sort of cigar shaped. That minimizes drag as it moves through the water. The lack of things that stick out from the body, so instead of having large limbs, they're just very small flippers. No externally visible hind limbs, so again, that smooths the body outline. And then the lack of hair for the most part. So we know that dolphins have just a few vibrissae around their faces, but they don't have hair all over their bodies that would create this turbulent flow situation.
So we've already taken a look at some of the things that allow cetaceans to be very fast swimmers. Now we're going to look at the adaptations that allow them to stay submerged for a long period of time. And these have to do with changes to the respiratory system and the circulatory system. Now there are a bunch of things that happen in vertebrates generally when vertebrates are underwater. This is called the diving reflex. So this happens across the board to any vertebrate when it finds itself in the water. The first is bradycardia. That means slow heart. So that means that the heart rate slows down. And in cetaceans, this is pretty substantial. So during long dives, their heart rate goes down to about half of what it is when they're up at the surface and breathing. So this slows the rate of use of oxygen, right? If the heart is only pumping half as fast, the blood is only delivering half as much oxygen to the tissues. So it stretches out the amount of time that oxygen is being carried through the circulatory system. The second thing is peripheral vasoconstriction. Remember, we looked at this picture earlier in the semester when we talked about countercurrent heat exchange, that there are some structures where countercurrent heat exchange happen. Those are these. But then there are also superficial veins that can be closed off. This is in the flippers and in the dorsal fin and also in the tail. I think this one is the tail. In all of these structures that are exposed to the water, there are these superficial veins that can close off and conserve heat by keeping most of the circulation in the body core. So what that means is that the blood can be shunted to the vital organs, to the heart, to the lungs, to the brain, and so only those tissues are using appreciable amounts of oxygen, and the rest of the tissues of the body are temporarily oxygen deprived. So that means that the oxygen that is in the circulatory system lasts longer. Now there are specialized adaptations that we find in cetaceans that we don't find in terrestrial mammals. So there are extra capillaries in the lungs. Oxygen diffuses into the circulatory system across that surface area in the alveoli of the lungs. So if there are more capillaries there, then there's a faster rate of diffusion of oxygen from the atmosphere and the lungs into the circulatory system. So that enables them to have more oxygen stored in their body. They can also extract oxygen much more efficiently from every breath of air they take. And that is related to their ability to force the air out of their lungs when they're exhaling. So if you look at most terrestrial animals, and humans are a good example of that, we actually only exhale a small proportion of the air that's in our lungs. It's about 10 to 15% of the air that's in our lungs is exhaled, and the rest of it just sort of sits in our lungs. And when we inhale, we're only bringing in a little bit of fresh air. On the other hand, whales and dolphins can exhale around 85% of the air in their lungs. So it's kind of flip-flopped. They're exhaling almost everything out of their lungs, and when they bring in a new breath, they're bringing in lots of fresh air, lots of fresh oxygen, whereas terrestrial mammals are just exhaling a little bit and only bringing in a little bit of fresh air, and so there's less oxygen generally in the lung space of a terrestrial mammal compared to a cetacean. So of that air that's breathed in, the cetacean can pull more oxygen out of that air because of those extra capillaries and because they have more red blood cells and therefore more hemoglobin. So there's quicker diffusion out of the lungs into the circulatory system and more ability to carry lots of oxygen in the circulatory system because of all of those extra red blood cells carrying extra hemoglobin. Then if you look at the muscular tissue, they have more myoglobin in that muscular tissue. Now, myoglobin kind of grabs the oxygen from hemoglobin in the blood. So it's sort of a handoff from the blood to the tissues. And when there's a lot of myoglobin, it can also serve as a storage point for oxygen. So you have lots of oxygen in the circulatory system, and then lots of oxygen stored in the muscle tissues where it's going to be gradually used up. So in combination with that ability to store more oxygen in different compartments of the body, cetaceans also have an extremely high tolerance to carbon dioxide and to lactic acid. The carbon dioxide is a product of cellular metabolism. So as oxygen is used, the cells are producing carbon dioxide, and that has to be carried out through the circulatory system and exhaled. In terrestrial mammals, when that builds up, there's an inescapable urge to breathe. And you can, well, I don't want to say you can try this. When I was a kid in middle school, kids would make themselves faint by holding their breath and spinning around and standing up and doing all kinds of wacky things. But if you do that, you will always resume breathing. You can't hold your breath until you die because your body reaches a point where carbon dioxide gets to a certain level and you have to breathe. That doesn't happen with cetaceans. They have a much higher tolerance to carbon dioxide. And if you can imagine, for a whale or dolphin, it would have fatal consequences if they were underwater at a great depth and had an urgent need to breathe and couldn't reach the surface in time. So they're much more tolerant to carbon dioxide. The tolerance to lactic acid, the lactic acid is produced as a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. So when you don't have oxygen around, cellular metabolism results in the production of lactic acid. And eventually, when you bring more oxygen into your system, it's fully metabolized and the lactic acid is broken down. But that has to happen after you breathe. So while a cetacean is submerged, they don't have the ability to breathe. And so they are tolerant to the buildup of lactic acid that occurs during their prolonged periods of anaerobic metabolism. The last aspect of adaptations for aquatic living has to do with being able to tolerate high pressures that are associated with diving very, very deep in the water column. Human beings have a really hard time dealing with the pressure that comes with going deeper down in the water. If you've ever tried to go to the bottom of a swimming pool, you've probably felt the pressure on your ears. Pressure increases very, very quickly as you go down in the water column. Human divers using scuba equipment can keep breathing as they move around in the water column, but there are some very serious consequences to spending time in those deep environments. When humans are in deep dives, they incorporate more gases into their tissues. The gases like oxygen and nitrogen are dissolved into their body tissues and the fluids within their body. And that's fine as long as they are at very deep pressures. But as they start to rise up in the water column, pressure starts to decrease. And at that point, the gas wants to come out of its dissolved state and form into gas again. And if that occurs within your circulatory system or within your tissues, it can kill you. It causes pain in your tissues, and it can cause air embolisms in other points of your circulatory system. So those of you who are scuba certified know all about this. It's a real problem for humans. And for other mammals that are diving, if you continue to breathe in air, you get overloaded with gases dissolved into your tissues. And the only way to get around it for us is to rise very, very slowly up through the water column so that we can exhale those gases and they don't form into bubbles within our tissues and within our circulatory system. So how do cetaceans get around that? Because they're going up and down in the water column all the time. And it turns out it has to do with their lung structure. Their lungs are very, very compressible. So if you look at human airways, there's a lot of reinforcement with cartilage down into the fairly deep airways so that they stay open even under high pressures. But in cetaceans, their lungs collapse very, very compactly as the pressure increases. And that forces any air that's still in the lungs up into the upper respiratory tract where there's no gas exchange occurring. So the reinforcement of the upper airways just keeps that high pressured air there, but doesn't allow extra gases to be dissolved into the circulatory system. And so because of that, cetaceans can go up in the water column and they don't have this problem of the gases forming bubbles within their circulatory system and within their tissues. So to follow this up, there is a worksheet, a two-part worksheet that is posted on the worksheet page that deals with diving in cetaceans and comparing it to diving in humans.